Welcome, folks, to episode 0 of Mixed Extents, in which we'll be talking about database backups. My name is Andrew Pruski, and I'm here with Mark Wilkinson and Anthony Nocentino, and special guest, Argenis Fernandez, who is a principal architect at Pure Storage, works with customers around the world to make sure they don't have to worry about their infrastructure for data. He's a former data platform MVP, former VMware expert, Microsoft certified master, and more recently worked in the Azure Data SQL Server engineering team as a principal PM in the Tiger team. He loves Cheetos, but not the big Cheetos. Welcome, Argenis.
Thank you, sir.
And we have Mike Fowle, is a specialist in data management technologies. As a community advocate, public speaker, and blogger, Mike is a practicing thought leader for data and automation. He is passionate about DevOps and data, building platforms to optimize, protect, and use data efficiently. And since 1999, Mike has been working in the database field, focusing primarily on SQL Server and specialized in automating data solutions to improve the reliability and efficiency of his environments. He currently works for Rubrics, my bad, as manager of database solutions, and has been caught playing the trombone in public on more than one occasion. So welcome both to you, Argenis and Michael. Thank you for joining us. How are you all doing today?
Very good. Thanks for having us.
Doing all right.
Okay, so today's topic is database backups, hence why we have two storage experts here. So I'm a DBA, and I'm using my native backups to back up all my databases. Should I be considering snapshots to replace or complement my existing backup solution?
I mean, I would say complement. You know, there can be, well, so this obviously you're sort of leading in. I might be putting words in your mouth, so tell me if I am.
Oh, I'm not going anywhere. It's an open-ended question.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, you know, the age-old question of snapshots versus backups, right? And the reality is that, well, that they kind of mean slightly two different things. I mean, we usually think about snapshots, storage snapshots. Hey, I'm going to snap the volume and have a copy of my files, which can be an effective solution for backups in a way, also effective for copy data management. But the problem that you always run into with snapshots is they're dependent on the storage array. And so if you lose the storage array, you lose your backups. So when you say, okay, well, can I use, if I'm using native backups, what should I be doing around storage snapshots? At a default, I'd say you're using them to complement your backups. If you were looking to replace those backups, then you need something, you need a way to get those snapshots off of primary storage, right? So you can actually recover from them. And that's a longer discussion I'm sure we'll get into, but I don't know, Argenis, thoughts, comments?
Oh, I have a thing or two to say about that.
I'm sure you do. This is Argenis. He has opinions.
So, first things first, right? Mike and I both agree that snapshots are not backups per se, unless, and the unless already Mike already kind of gave it away, right? Unless you offload them to another storage device that is hopefully on a different data center than the one that you're taking your backups on, because data centers do go up in flames. So that's my background. We have literally seen them. I mean, we've had customers that had to open a hole on the wall because the AC went off in a data center and they needed to expel the hot air somehow. So they opened a hole in the wall. This kinds of things happen, right? So the important thing with snapshots is they are really good restores. Like, they're amazing restores because there is no size of data operation involved in restoring a snapshot. And that's fundamentally good. Unless you're bringing that offloaded snapshot that's sitting on some other device, you're bringing it into your primary storage device that's actually where your database is located. That is obviously a size of data operation as you transfer that snapshot across the network into that device. But if you have a snapshot that lives locally and has been replicated somewhere else, if you're testing that snapshot on the other side, more importantly, testing it, because their backups are just untested restores, right? And that's the problem with people not testing. People don't do enough testing. When you have facilities on the storage side, regardless of what they are, for bringing one of those snapshots online and doing stuff with them, the very first thing that you should do is test them. How do you test them? Well, there's a myriad of ways of testing, right? You can run CheckDB. You can go completely and orderly paranoid with, data purity if you want to, like to validate absolutely every single thing within your database. You can do that. But that's really what's going to give you the warm and fuzzies about your restore strategy, or bringing stuff back into your primary array so you can feel comfortable that it'll actually come online when you attempt to bring it on. But yeah, snapshots are not backups but they're really freaking good restores.
So why do you think there hasn't been so many would you say there's a bigger uptake in people using snapshots for restores, or would people be still a little bit afraid of using them from maybe, say, past experiences that they've had as before the technology say has progressed to the state it is in now?
I mean, there's a lot of, to use a sales term, because both Argenis and I are in sales. You'll hear the term FUD, right? Fear, uncertainty. What does the D stand for? I forget what the D is. Doubt, right? So, but a lot of it tends to be kind of either unproven, or that's just the way it is. And there's a lot of that around snapshots, and a lot of what I talk about is VSS, which we can get into more as we go through this, right? But there's been a lot of changes in the technology. There's been a lot of improvements in it. And also it does come down to, the right tool for the job. Again, snapshots for certain kinds of operations, like particularly for me, I think about for copy data management, right? If I want to make, make a bunch of copies of my database, the traditional way is to back it up natively and restore it to other locations. The problem is that can be very consuming from a storage standpoint. And a lot of the more modern storage systems, when you snap it, when you have that snapshot, it's kind of maintaining the deltas, but you're not actually physically recreating the data every time. So that becomes a really effective tool for distributing, making different copies, pushing production down to development and the like. So I think really it's just kind of that, like, people are uncertain of it. There's been a lot of people dogging on it for a while, but a lot of that's just like, well, that's the way it used to be. And there's, with all the improvements, people probably should be taking a second look.
So do you think in that context, do you think a challenge is the people that are involved? Because, a lot of us started off working with SQL Server, and then we're like, hey, oh, that's what a SAN is. And then I have to learn about these things like snapshots and worry about volumes and how I lay out my data so that I can take advantage of these operations. Is that kind of a disconnect that you're seeing in the field?
This is literally where the separation of duties does not help.
Right.
Because the DBAs are not talking to the storage admins or the VM admins for that matter. Because that's the other kind of snapshot that you can take, one of the VM, not necessarily of the storage, from the storage side. Mm-hmm. And it may or may not be integrated with the storage side as well. So yeah, that is fundamentally a big disconnect out there. And one of the things that I keep saying on my presentations is everyone should talk to each other. And you're not talking to each other because you have these buckets of responsibilities, and that becomes more of a political problem than a collaboration problem, right? Enterprises should really be all about collaboration and not political distressing or political silos, which is
totally.
I've seen that everywhere, and it's just a big issue in general.
Yeah, one of my biggest customers for a long time shifted to an enterprise backup solution. As DBAs, we all love enterprise backup solutions, right? But the key difference in this scenario was the engineer that was in charge of the backup platform was fantastic to work with, and we made it happen. And so we were able to get access to stuff and be able to write our own PowerShell commandlets to be able to automate restores and things like that. But the key in that scenario was the people, not the technology.
So I can agree more that when you have qualified folks that are ready to transfer knowledge to each other, that's the best possible scenario. Right? When you have a DBA that wants to talk to a storage person and they want to share what they know about the scenario that they're trying to solve together, that's when you come up with good results. Fantastic.
Yeah, the only other thing I would throw in there is what does DBA stand for? Well, one of them is does about anything, right? The database is at the center of the stack, and it's networking, it's storage, it's application code. That's the thing about being a DBA is you really need to have a little bit of knowledge, not a lot, but a little bit of knowledge about all the different things that the database touches, because at some point, whether it's, hey, why is the database slow? Or what are my options? right, around the platform? What tools can I leverage to basically make my life easier?
PowerShell.
It's funny. You guys were saying enterprise backup solution, and I was thinking of Ola scripts.
No. I'm talking about the stuff that, is the general purpose backup solutions for the enterprise.
That to me is really an enterprise backup solution.
100% agree as well. Yeah.
Right.
I work for a data protection vendor. I will say I am a big fan of Ola scripts. If I were to put my vendor hat on, I could discuss some of the concerns I have with it. But at the end of the day, I would certainly say that Ola's tools are a wonderful free resource.
Especially for the price. Yeah, they're great.
Right.
So with, we hear snapshots, and yes, I mean, you're saying they can replace or maybe complement, and they're not backups as such. There was a conversation on Twitter a while ago that why we started asking these questions, because of the conversation in the community about how people used to see snapshots and maybe they need to be a little bit more educated. One thing I saw come up quite a bit was they can't do point-in-time restores, which I saw, Argenis, that you seem to disagree with slightly.
So I think Mike can answer this question better because he deals with that one a lot more than I have.
Okay.
But I'll throw in my
no, absolutely no.
Go for it,
Mike. For you in the fire, Mike.
Let's go down the rabbit hole, shall we? Okay, so there's a couple things at play here. First off, when it comes to SQL Server, let me step back just a slight bit. For doing any database snapshot, the large concern is what do you do with I/O that's in flight, right? If we think about when I take a backup, let's just say native backup solution, right? That is actually going to mark an LSN. And then start the backup and then mark another LSN when everything's complete. So there's a transactionally consistent backup state that whenever we go to do that restore, it knows how to, SQL Server knows how to coordinate the LSNs. Well, a snapshot happens outside of that, kind of, and we'll get to that. But that snapshot that happens outside of it, when I'm doing that backup, there's a couple things at play. First off, obviously the transactional state, but that transactional state internally by SQL manages the in-flight I/O. Whereas, dirty reads and dirty writes, a snapshot doesn't do that. Snapshot's just like, okay, well, I'm going to take the current state of the file system and just grab it, right? And so that's where, when we start talking about point-in-time restore, we have to be able to take a snapshot that is in what's called an application consistent state. So there's two types of snapshots you can take, crash consistent or application consistent. The way I think about it is application consistent is going to mark the LSNs, it's going to interact with SQL Server, look like a full backup typically. A crash consistent is almost like what happens when I'm taking a backup as if I had pulled the power plug, right? So when I restore that snapshot, it's going to go through crash recovery like it normally does, but you're going to lose those in-flight IOs. So now we're starting to talk about the differences there. So when we talk about, okay, point-in-time restore with a snapshot, no, you can't do a point-in-time. Technically, you cannot do a point-in-time snapshot restore. You can restore at any point in time that you take the snapshot, right? But either from an application consistent format or a crash consistent format, it's going to come up at the moment I took the snapshot. Now the difference is if I take an application consistent snapshot, then I'm actually restoring the database with those LSNs intact. And if I'm using the VSS engine, now I can bring that database. VSS will allow me to restore that snapshot in a no recovery state, and now I can apply transaction logs in a normal SQL recovery process. So, like I said, some nuance there, some operational things about that, how that happens. But the fundamental statement: can a snapshot do point-in-time recovery? No. But can I use it to accomplish point-in-time recovery? It depends.
Right, so.
Well, I mean, are there going to be scenarios where you'd want to use crash consistent over application consistent?
Oh, yeah. Well, so application consistent, it requires, everybody's heard about the infamous IO freeze, right? Hey, I've got to do an IO freeze, and that's going to pause the IO, pause the database.
This was literally going to be my next question.
Right. So first off, if I'm doing an application consistent snapshot, I have to do the IO freeze because we talk about those in-flight IOs, right? Well, when I take an application consistent snapshot using typically VSS, it's going to call the SQL. It's going to enact checkpoints. It's going to mark the backup as started. It's going to look like a full database backup. But then what happens is we also have to freeze the IO so that no changes are happening to the subsystem while we're taking the backup, or I should say creating the snapshot. Once the snapshot's created, the IO can be released, and any process would work off of that snapshot that we created. So it's usually a very short process. We can get into a larger conversation about what can extend a VSS snapshot, but typically you would expect to see it in the milliseconds if it's done properly, or maybe 1 to 2 seconds depending on how it's enacted.
So
I don't know, Argenis, you want to throw anything in there?
I do want to throw a few things in there because I am a firm believer in modernizing VSS by getting rid of it. Like, the way that I
talk about that, yeah.
I mean, we've talked about this, right, Mike? This is technology that was built essentially 15 plus years ago, okay? And it wasn't really designed for super high transactional databases that cannot withstand a pause, right? Because it's designed for, guess what? Really outdated storage subsystems where the in-flight IO problem that Mike described is very much a real thing. Right. So in newer storage subsystems, you have some of them, not all, have the capability of actually handling every single IO that's considered in flight and make it part of the snapshot. So, for example, the systems that have an area of a non-volatile cache where the IO's incoming writes are received. And include those IOs as part of the snapshot, along with the volume itself that's been laid out in the persistence layer, whether it be disk or SSD or whatever. Those can actually be good snapshots or crash consistent snapshots that will recover every time, right? And I have a blog post out there of one such example, right? Where you can pretty much prove that even though you're hammering the database super hard, with transactions, incoming transactions, you can continuously take snapshots, and each and every single one of those will recover. So that's an interesting proposition, right? If we have this new tech on the storage side that allows you to recover the database consistently every time, then what's missing really, it's the bridge between SQL Server and that technology so that you can actually start doing interesting things like point-in-time recovery from a non-VSS snapshot. Such thing is possible, but it requires changes to the engine fundamental. And these are things that Mike and I have talked about, and we have actually had good conversations with the PMs on the Tiger team about these things, because we feel that the path forward is that where you actually decouple the snapshot goodness or the validity or the consistency of a snapshot from SQL Server altogether. Because if you keep having a strong dependency between the two things, you're going to have to bake more code for every single environment that you deal with. In the case of SQL Server, since it runs on Windows, Linux, containers, etc., this becomes a complex problem, right? Because guess what? Azure is another thing. Like, are you going to do the VSS in Azure? Like, how does that work? You know what I mean? These are all things that Microsoft has top of mind. And Mike and I have discussed with the PMs for that, because we really want to see a path forward that allows the snapshots to be taken without having any dependencies on the RDBMS. And guess who does that? Oracle. Oracle has done that for years. They let you take crash consistent snapshots and do point-in-time recovery on top of them, which is neat.
But how does that work from a execution standpoint? Say, like, I'm not familiar with Oracle, so do I execute a command in the engine and then have to coordinate the underlying snapshot? Is that how that has to work?
Yeah, so Oracle has a statement, I believe it's alter database start backup and then alter database end backup. Mm-hmm. So much like in SQL Server, like if we think about internal backup mechanics, right? I say backup database, there's a few things that happen. It first will do a checkpoint, right? Flushes all the stuff down to disk so that it's capturing all the dirty data, right? It's hardening that the state of the database. Then it marks the LSN, starts writing all that stuff off. If we're just talking native stuff, right, to your .bak file. And then when it ends the backup, it marks the LSN, right? And and then it writes the metadata. So if we think about like Oracle, when I do that alter database, start backup, it's basically doing all those initial phases and marking what Oracle would consider an LSN. I can't exactly remember what it is off the top of my head, but then they don't really care what you do with the database at that point. They're like, well, you started a backup, so you back it up and do whatever. And I'm just handling the database mechanics around it. And then when I do alter database and backup, then it kind of, bookends it. Right?
Is it the file then? Is it the actual database files that are backed up? And is that the backup? Or do I still dump it to another block device?
Yeah, I mean, so Oracle will let you, like, RMAN will let you create image backup files, or you can take a storage snapshot.
Okay.
Like you could just like I said, Oracle doesn't care what you're doing to the database to back up the database. It's just knowing that you've started a backup, you do whatever you want to do, you end the backup. And typically that's a storage snapshot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Typically, because I've talked to DBAs, Oracle DBAs all the time, who are like, well, I can back up my database in 9 seconds. Right? Because they're doing a storage snapshot. Now that comes back to, is that really a backup? Because again, if they're taking it as a storage snapshot, the storage system goes away. I mean, there are plenty of real world examples of where, Oracle DBAs lost their jobs because they thought they had backups and the storage system died and they didn't. But we digress. Like I said, this is the decoupling that I, to kind of get on a soapbox that Argenis and I would like to see in the SQL engine, because the problem with VSS is VSS tightly couples all that together. It is not only the starting of the backup, but then the actual taking of the snapshot and the restoring of the backup. The other thing that it does is kind of interesting, right? I mentioned the whole point in time recovery thing. I can use so when I restore that VSS snapshot, I have, using the VSS engine, I can bring the database, I can restore it in no recovery mode, right? Or I can basically, I shouldn't say I'm restoring it, I'm attaching the database files. Because really, when I take a snapshot, I'm just copying the MDFs and the LDFs and the NDFs. I'm not actually writing a .bak. It's a different operation. So VSS actually allows me to attach the MDF and the LDF and the NDFs in a no recovery mode, which we don't get right now with the native stuff. And that could unlock a lot of possibilities. And again, that's me on a soapbox. We've talked to the PMs. We know they're actually looking at that, but it's not an easy problem to solve.
SQL Server PMs, if you're watching this, please build attach with no recovery. Thank you.
So not even got a kid.
Seriously. Just to finish this off, the biggest deal is that that tight coupling of VSS and the database engine and the storage thing, whatever it is, that is the biggest issue right there. Right? So getting rid of that, of all that glue, is difficult. We understand, but this is all for the better, because you're literally just putting the onus on the storage vendor or the backup vendor to do with that backup whatever they want, and they can then guarantee. This is actually good for Microsoft, because Microsoft doesn't have to deal with supporting that whole stack anymore, right? They can just say, oh, we place a database in hot backup mode or whatever they want to call it, and we can see that something started happening on the other side. Go talk to them. You know what I mean?
It'd be nice to see something that way, because we've been backing up databases in SQL Server the same way for forever, basically. Yeah. So something coming up that, and the point about Oracle saying start backup, the database then goes into backup mode, whereas then you can do what you want with it, and then you end your backup. I find really, really interesting.
That was super smart of Oracle. That was super smart of Oracle. They don't have to deal with, what's happening behind the scenes on the storage side. At that point, the integrity and the consistency of the backup is entirely on the vendor. You're done. So I like that approach a lot.
I'm going to say something probably heretical here, right? But
go for it.
I think Oracle as a technology is amazing. As a database platform, Oracle has some incredible strengths.
Get out.
It's just,
and its biggest strength is the ability to make money.
Right. We need to screen these panelists.
Hey, I love SQL Server, and it will always be close to my heart. But I mean, let's be real, right? We can recognize the advantages of some of these other technologies.
Absolutely.
And Oracle's problem has always been the business model. Always been.
Yeah.
So not even going to kid, you guys already answered this question. One of the questions that I had was, if there was one enhancement to SQL Server backups that you could get tomorrow, what would it be? Mostly because I've had this conversation
I have
with
another
both of you.
one. I have another one.
Oh, go on. Yes,
Just
absolutely.
one?
I mean, I have another one. I can't keep talking about this stuff forever, Mike. Incremental backups. So not
Yeah.
differential, but actually incremental backups. Wouldn't that be nice?
Well, what would be interesting, I'm going to go do another, because again, working at the company that I work at, in the role I'm in, I see more than just SQL Server, right? I actually manage a team of specialists, and we do a lot of Oracle. Oracle has an interesting thing called incremental merge that I would like to see added to SQL Server. So if we talk about Oracle backups, right, you might have heard like level 0, level 1. Essentially, they can do a full backup. They can do a differential backup, which is all the changes since the last full. And then to Argenis' point, I can do an incremental, which is all the changes since the last backup, whether it's a full or an incremental. But then what I can do with Oracle is an incremental merge. So what happens is you got to configure as a window, but what it will do is you set a window, say a 3-day window or a 7-day window, and you start taking incrementals. And then when it starts to roll off the window, it'll take that last incremental and actually merge it into your level 0. So you're basically,
pretty cool.
you're merging your.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if I had that in SQL Server, because I'm going to fall into my sales pitch a little bit, just a little. Challenge with SQL Server backups and the way we've always been doing SQL Server backups. And I get why, I think everybody recognizes why. But the reason we're looking for innovation here is it's all about time and storage. Because when I take that full backup, I have to take the full database backup. And when we talk about terabytes of data, I mean, that's time, right? I have to ship all that data, whether or not only like a percentage, and typically with large databases, you're only having a small percentage of the data actually change. So one, I have to take all the time to scan the database file, write those changes across, and move that somewhere. But then two, I mean, it's still a big backup. So whatever sort of innovation we can develop, to make these backups easier to manage, to make them, take less time, because that's the other thing, right? Our backup windows get longer and longer, then I can't do other maintenance during it. I have to wait for it. It's just kind of this compounding problem. And that's why we're so desperate for some innovation around it.
Yeah, it's the old dreaded byte by agonizing byte kind of thing, right? It's bytes being read from the database, bytes being written for the backup, bytes being read from the backup, and bytes being written to the database. That's the whole thing. I mean, right there, there's 4 sites of data operations for every freaking backup, right? It's just pain and suffering. So integrating, more with how storage subsystems work these days, with the ability to stream data off your primary storage system. That's really what the future should look like, right? I mean, imagine something where you're restoring a snap that is not physically within the same array or storage device that you're at. And say, I'm restoring this snapshot. It's not here, but I'm restoring the snapshot. I have the metadata for it, so I can load that metadata up as I transfer the data that may be sitting somewhere else, and bring the database online as it comes, right? And you can build intelligent algorithms on top of that, where you say, oh, I need my boot page, and I need the first 4 gigs worth of PFS and GAMS and SGAMS and whatever. You can build something like that, right? I mean, you can come up with technologies that are entirely integrated on the back end, but this looks very much like a disaggregated storage layer from the database itself, right? And that in itself is controversial, to say the least. So you have to convince a lot of people that this is actually a good path forward, or you just make those kinds of functionality on the storage side, and then work with each independent database vendor, so they kind of start providing those couplings between that functionality and the storage side.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit too on all this conversation, right? The flaw or the concern, as it were, right, is you start to build out these dependency chains. So if we talk about incremental backup processes, we talk about incremental chains and the like. I mean, if we think about it from a native SQL backup perspective, right? If I take a full and then a differential, that differential is useless to me unless I have the full, right? So I always have these dependencies. And really what we're talking about here is expanding the dependency chain. So if I have a series of incremental backups, I have to still have that full to back it on. And if I lose one of the incrementals in the chain, then the whole thing falls over. So these are, while I think all these technologies are good and we want the innovation, I do want to make sure people are aware that, look, you need to at least understand how those chains are maintained. And that is the kind of the problem around it. And this is where, again, I'll come back to just where we started the whole conversation with, this is why I feel like snapshots and snapshot technologies are more complementary to some of these backup approaches or snapshot approaches, because at the end of the day, like, let's be real, right? Real talk, as Anthony's been saying. Data SQL backups work. They just work, right? That's, I think, why a lot of us go back to them is, I don't have to wonder about the mechanics. I don't have to wonder about the incremental chains. I don't have to wonder about any of that stuff. It just works. Now, oh, sorry.
I was going to say, and I think that's the comfort to DBAs, right? Is we, in our minds, think, well, we know SQL Server backups just work. We know Microsoft controls that code, so it's one cook in the kitchen, right? From a metaphor standpoint. However, if that functionality that you guys described is put into the engine, then you're achieving that same goal and homogenizing the stack, right? Yeah. I just got to copy some bytes off somewhere, and I know that thing's consistent because SQL Server told me so.
Yeah. I'm bringing it up more as kind of an educational point, right? That we need to at least be considering these things. Again, at some point, you got to say, well, I'm going to get off the horse-drawn cart and get into the automobile, even though I'm not sure about this whole internal combustion thing, right?
I think that's a really good point. But we want to try these new technologies out, but I'd say a core task of the DBAs is my backups. They're sacrosanct. We do not touch them. We have a process that works. All right, it might take me X amount of hours to back up my databases, but I know they will work. If someone comes around and goes, oh, we can use this technology and take them in 9 seconds, I'd be very, very skeptical until that, it's tried and proven. And maybe we need someone just to take that, first step and start saying, hey, we don't do native backups anymore. We do this. We've had outages. We've recovered. Maybe it's just getting over that initial fear of moving away from a native solution to let's be honest, it will be a vendor-specific solution, which I think might be a problem.
To explode.
Number one thing is, backups exist because of fear. So let's face it.
Yeah.
And it's a valid concern. It's a valid fear, right? You're being paranoid out of reality. Like, your storage subsystem.
Is it paranoia when you're right?
Oh yeah, no. It absolutely. Paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you.
Simple as that. So here's the other thing that goes along with all of this discussion that we've been having. We can do all these things that we're talking about, but our ability to back up the data has diminished as the amount of data increases.
Yes,
we're having a harder time catching up on how fast we back up things. And so that's one of my biggest things in general, where I see databases being backed up at 200 megabytes per second. My teeth start grinding when I see that. Right? You should be. I mean, the devices that Mike sells and the ones that I sell, they are both capable of doing multi-gigabytes per second of throughput. And your big databases should be going at that speed for backups, because this is a fundamental thing. A backup is not a backup until it's actually fully written to wherever it has to go outside of your primary storage. That's a backup.
Yeah.
So if you take a snapshot and you say the snapshot completed in 9 seconds, was it offloaded in 9 seconds? No, it took 3 hours. So how long did your backup take?
Yeah. Okay.
You know what I mean? So this whole thing is a very convoluted conversation on understanding what is your actual RTO and RPO. Like how safely are you taking your backups? How comfortable are you saying I can recover from any failure and go back to that point in time? The reality is that most of us don't understand that. Like, we don't have those numbers in front of us.
And I'm just going to ask the question, how do you know that? How do you know you can hit your RTO?
Testing.
Absolutely.
The only way.
Yeah. It like, this is where I've been kind of there's something I always like to share around this, right? I have when it comes to backups, I have what I call my 3 rules of recovery, right? Gotta have the rule of 3. Right?
Down. Hold on.
Right. Is there a blog post?
You can read about it in his upcoming book.
I might have put it on my blog at some point. But basically, the idea is that one, I have to have a backup, right? None of this gets started until I've actually taken a backup, to Argenis' point, right? Number 2, I have to be able to get at that backup. And I think that's where the whole snapshot thing is a backup. You know, does that make sense? Because if I can't get at the backup, then I don't have one, all right? And then the third one is what we were just talking about is, can I restore that backup? And do I know how long that restore is going to take? And for me, those are always the 3 things that I'm trying to keep in mind when I'm building out my recovery strategy. And it, you know, does that fit in the RTOs and the RPOs? Sure. You know, those are the additional considerations. But without those 3 things, then I'm not doing my job as a DBA.
So I think the challenge there then is really, you know, the information management. How do I know that it occurred? And then the tooling to bring it back, right? Because I'm so used to seeing this in a single pane of glass instead of SQL Server. I have MSDB, all of my backups. I can use OLA stuff, DBA tools, and get all that stuff with all the goodness I'm used to getting it at with those tools. But when I start talking backups and snapshots and vendors and web portals and REST APIs, and it gets to be overwhelming and challenging, right?
Well, I mean, it's just learning new stuff, right? I mean, I would look at it in, you know, it makes me think of PowerShell when I was first getting into PowerShell, and the number of folks I talked to is like, why do I need to learn PowerShell? I already know T-SQL.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
the exact same thing, actually. I had some guy say, why are you writing that with PowerShell? You know, there's this magical language called SQL. I'm like, yes.
Do you drive your kids to school in your lawnmower?
Yeah, and it really ultimately comes back to the right tool for the job. And, you know, again, real talk, vendors are going to want you to use their platform. So there's going to be a little bit of vendor lock-in in the way things are designed. That's right. You know, I think most vendors want to make it open and accessible via an API and some sort of scripting where possible. But yeah, you know, I think, you know, we can be honest about, you know, they're going to want you to use the platform, and so they're going to want you to use their interface to do it. That doesn't mean you're restricted to the UI. And certainly, I would argue that any vendor who's making a solution where you have to go through a backup team to get your stuff back is doing it wrong. Mm-hmm. You know, I think that's the thing is like, just like anything else, snapshots are a tool. Using snapshots for backups, any of this stuff is a tool, and you just have to learn the technology to let you use that tool. And at the end of the day, it's going to be a bit of a learning curve, but most of the time it's going to save you something.
I think Argenis raised a really good point earlier about talking about maybe the social aspect of working in the office, because it's such a core task of a DBA. I think a lot of DBAs are very much balk and saying, oh, hang on, now the storage team are going to be taking my backups from me, that I'm going to be relying on them. And if there isn't that communication there, you're going to hit a hard wall from some DBAs. Like, that is just not going to happen at all. You can't take, I'm the one who has to look after I'm responsible for these databases. I'm keeping my native backups. If I have to go to, and you mentioned it as well, Mike, if I have to go to another team to get my databases restored. So I think there's a big thing there as well.
Sure.
Yeah, so the problem arises when there is a massive issue, right? The storage people are supposed to be in charge of the backup, so they know exactly how to fetch them. And for whatever reason, they start blaming each other on why things are not working. Like, I gave you the backup, why didn't you restore it? And then this is when IT turns into forensics and backstabbing. Like, right? Like, let me see what you actually did, so I can go to my boss and tell him you messed up. Like, this is the ugly side of IT that everyone hates, right? But you know, to kind of complement what Mike was saying, it's not just about UIs and automation, but also a ton about simplicity. Like, people like simplicity in general. We have overcomplicated things in IT to the nth degree. And I mean, I can already hear Nocentino's brain going like, Kubernetes is actually complex. Right? It's true. I mean, like, Kubernetes is not simple. Does it make a lot of tasks simple? Yes. Does it make a lot of other tasks complex? Yes. Right? So this is a thing in IT in general. And then what I feel that what succeeds, what wins in the end, it's really what drives Yeah, that automation, that ease of use, and at the same time gives you a seamless ways of doing things where you didn't have to click 100 times just to get to one thing. And so
That's like
UX is a huge part of what Mike's company does and what my company does as well. We invest a lot of that because that experience is super, super important. And we as a community, we're very critical of Microsoft and what they do with things like SSMS and ADS, but I don't think we're critical enough actually.
Yeah, well, and let's kind of extend a little bit. Like, I mean, when I was a DBA, and certainly the very first thing I would always automate when I went into any job was my backups. Backups are vital, backups are important, and backups are probably the most boring thing we do in our job. It's tedious as hell, right? Managing the jobs, managing the schedules, making sure everything gets written, cleaning up the files. And so, you know, that's usually the first thing a lot of us will automate. And that's really, I think, the goal. When you started saying like, oh, you know what, my storage team is not going to manage my backups. I don't know about that. That makes me uncomfortable. Well, first off, communicate, right? I'm always a big advocate of like, if you got a question, pick up the phone, no matter who it is, whether it's storage team, networking team, developers, whatever, have a conversation. But then in addition to that, right, if you can build that relationship and build that trust, you know, why shouldn't they handle the backups? As long as you know you can, you know, that your backup's taken, your backup you can get at it and you can restore it when you need it, who cares who takes it? Because that's more work off your plate where you can go do the interesting stuff, where you can go play with Kubernetes and learn about, you know, SQL on Linux and do all these other things that, I mean, like we always hear the adage, right? Oh, you know, DBAs are so busy, right? Well, we're making again, using our Argenis thing, we overcomplicate things. We make our lives more complicated. We kind of take on busy work. So I challenge people to say, look, what can I do to kind of minimize what I'm doing? What can I do to hand stuff off? I'm happy if somebody else is taking my backups, as long as I know I can fulfill my 3 conditions.
You know what?
Learn PowerShell. That's how you can free up your time. Learn PowerShell.
I'm actually going there. Because you know what's super important for all of this? Drills, practice, testing. Like we do evacuation drills in our buildings. Why don't we do a DR test every freaking 6 months or whatever? Like you pick the whatever interval gets you that level of comfort. Well, you should be testing this stuff. And as a matter of fact, you should have a chaos monkey, an environment where you actually let loose a chaos monkey and to really test your ability to recover from any situation that happens in your data center.
Yeah.
That's what builds like that level of confidence and your ability to automate the responses to those chaotic events. So, I mean,
100% agree.
Right,
100% agree.
It's difficult. This is not straightforward, but this is how you build really good teams and really good engineering and really good comfort levels, really, about your enterprise and what you do.
So I'm going to, after all of my preaching just now about automation, I will also say that when I was a DBA, once a month, I would manually restore a database. I would go through, I'd pick a point in time, I'd get my full, get all my logs, get it all in order, run my, I had tools and scripting to help me get there, but ultimately it would be restore database with no recovery, restore log, so on and so forth. So I kept that knife sharp, right? Because this also comes back to last line of defense, right? We have these tools, we have these technologies, they're all great, but when the fecal matter hits the aerial dispersion unit, you've got to know what you need to know, right? You don't want to be in a situation where like you need to drill it, right? You need to have the emergency drill and be ready to go in case the worst absolutely happens.
Yeah, that's what I always tell customers. The last thing I always want to do when something's going wrong is think. I just want to do, right?
You don't want to be relying on something that's untested because these things never break down at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. This is always 3 o'clock on a Sunday morning that you might have had a couple of glasses of wine the night before thinking, I'm on call, I'll get away with it, it'll be fine. And
no idea
at that point, I always talk about, I do a session on chaos engineering. I always talk about one instance where I was using, this is a few jobs ago, where I was using a third-party backup tool to back up all my SQL databases because they were all 2005. We wanted compression, didn't do it natively. This tool did it. And then one day someone came along to me and said, oh, we've run this SSIS package. It has just hacked away a load of data from this database that we didn't want it to. Can you point in time restore this database for me, please? I was like, absolutely. My tool's there. It's been backing this database up. No problem. I've got all the logs. So I was in the little UI, and this tool had a instant restore feature. Now the database is like 3 terabytes in size. So who wouldn't want to instantly restore a 3 terabyte database? So I selected all my backups, clicked on the instant restore, hit execute, and it went all the way up to 99%, where it stayed for about 5 hours and then promptly failed. So I hadn't been testing using that feature. So I absolutely agree with you both. They're like drilling and running and testing every single time, because you want those tools to work when you really need them to.
And you need to know what your options are. And the only way you're going to do that. So just to also reference, in my bio, caught playing the trombone in public. So my secret shame is I have a music performance degree. I studied how to play trombone in college. And that's why I still play it today, even though right now I'm not, because the orchestra can't get together to rehearse. Anyway, but my instructor in college had a saying: you perform how you practice and you practice how you perform, right? You're building muscle memory, you're building the behaviors in practice so that when you're on stage, it's just another day, right? It's just another thing. And that's the same thing with the resource, or honestly, mostly any of these things we're talking about, any of these tasks. If you're comfortable when you practice, then again, when everything goes wrong, when you've had those couple of glasses of wine at 3 a.m, it's not a big deal.
This is when the playbook or the run book comes into the equation, right? If you have to write the playbook as you're recovering, as you're going through the emergency, you're doing it very wrong, because it's supposed to be pre-built, pre-baked, and you should have multiple versions of it depending on what it is that went wrong. And you should even have code assist for those things, meaning, oh, I can quickly generate a script that will get me all my statements to restore my database. That sort of thing is super important. Right? You shouldn't just rely on your ability to write those scripts, because you can write them. It'll take you longer when you're in the midst of the emergency. So do that beforehand, right? Practice your disaster. And then when the disaster comes, you'll be way ready, right? Because that muscle memory that Mike was talking about, that's already there, right? And it doesn't have to be all muscle memory. You can automate a portion of that memory. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yep, 100% with you there. Right, we're coming up to the top of the hour, so we're going to sort of start a roll down. We'll do one final question, and I think it's, what future technologies, or what would you like to see in storage technologies that are coming up? Can you give us any insight what's coming? If you can, what are you excited about? Or just pick something that you would love to see coming up in the future.
Man, there's so many things that I want. I guess one thing that I would love to see is persistent memory with hardware level replication to another compute node through RDMA. Like, that would be fantastic. Like, that would be awesome. I used to be the PM for PMEM support for the SQL Server Engine, so I know that's sorely lacking. And the part of why people are not adopting PMM as much is because you cannot replicate a PMM to another box, or have like PMM RAID kind of thing. You can, but it's not at the software level, and you kind of miss the whole point. So yeah, I'm looking forward to persistent memory developing overall as a paradigm for storage, and not just to be used as a in-box kind of thing where it belongs to this certain compute node, but more of a hyper-converged kind of scenario for persistent memory. So Azure Stack HCI is doing some things in that regard that are interesting. So that's where I really love to see that, but I have a list. So
we'll have you back.
We'll have you. What about yourself, Mike?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting that Argenis mentioned hyper-converged stuff, right? Personally, I'd like to see more development around distributed systems for databases, right? I mean, the problem and the challenge, and it's just kind of the way that the platforms have developed. Oracle and SQL are most notorious of this. They're monolithic, right? They run on essentially one server. Sure, I can have availability groups or clustering or rack or whatever, but at the end of the day, it's like the idea is I have one big box. And we're seeing development. Like I'm really excited about like Cockroach DB, if you guys have heard of it or looked into it, which is a distributed database system. It's a relational database system that runs across multiple nodes, right? And that starts to give you the ability to scale out, as well as the better protection against failure, and gives you more resiliency. So I want to see more movement along. And I think big data clusters might be, starting to move in that direction a little bit, right? But that's kind of what I want to see, and where I sort of see the future, right? Is, we've always talked, and I think that's what the containers start to fall into, right? Is how do we get more scale out stuff? How do we get more on-demand things where we can spin up and spin down as we need to? And that's where I'm excited to see development, and that's what I'm looking forward to.
So yeah, I'll throw in one more thing on that, guys. So I guess you could sum it up as, databases should be a lot more cloud native, if you will, right? Where there's not so much dependency on any one thing. And they're a lot more resilient to anything failing, and being able to recover from that at any point, or respawn whatever it is that needs to respawn. So hyperscale is a step in that direction from the Microsoft point of view. It's just that technology has not come on-prem for SQL Server. It'll come on-prem for, with Azure Arc, it'll come on-prem for Postgres. I do an acquisition that Microsoft made, Citus Data. So that technology in general has legs, and it'll become more, become more prevalent. But what we have done essentially with that tech is just take that big box and break it into smaller boxes. But overall, the concept of any one box failing and everything recovering just nicely still has to kind of develop further. You know what I mean? And in that sense, I like Cockroach a lot because it's taking the right steps in that direction. The problem with Cockroach, where it stands today, is that it's not as mature as Oracle or SQL Server at dealing with those edge cases for disasters and a disk failing and a disk sector you weren't able to read from and that sort of thing. So that also has to develop. But even Linux has problems overall with hardening I/O and all of that. It has matured around those things as well in the last 2 years, but it's still a ways from. But this is really how we push technology forward, right? This is not just a SQL Server or Oracle or Cockroach discussion. Everything has to mature, and everything has to become easier, and everything has to become better overall.
And I'll get one more thing in here. I'm going to have the last word about it. I think that's the one thing, that I've certainly gotten more of an appreciation for working for a vendor is these development cycles. I know we all want to see this stuff come to market, and we're all excited about some of this stuff, but this stuff takes time. And I do, the one thing I've become a huge fan of what Microsoft is doing. I mean, I think it's the one thing where I would still preach SQL Server over some other technologies. But it's just because they seem to be trying to be more responsive and pay more attention. But it's you're turning the Titanic, and it's going to take time.
Awesome. Okay, that's about a wrap from us. So I just want to say a final thank you to Argenis and Mike. I'm Andrew Frosky here with Mark Wilkerson and Anthony Nocentino. You've been watching Mixed Extents. Thank you very much.
Cheers, everyone.